managed, I think, remarkably to reconcile that delicate balance. Now, as I mentioned, the 2025 conference coincides with the centenary of Chesterton's Everlasting Man, and so I thought to offer a different angle on the opening paper, and that is look at Chesterton's everlasting perspectives inserted in time, that is the immediate world of earthly activity. I'd like to look at another book Chesterton published in the very same year as The Everlasting Man, that is 1925. It's a biography of the 19th century English journalist and political activist William Cobbett. Cobbett's hardly a recognised name these days, and the Chesterton biography would be little remembered, I suspect. But it's worth resurrecting because it's by no means an unimportant book, and it illustrates that even when Chesterton focused on a forgotten figure from a dimly remembered past, he still wrote The Everlasting Man in time. He saw how the sacred intersected with the secular, and how the eternal world of truth and inspiration was connected with the ephemeral world of social advocacy and political action. Chesterton always saw himself first and foremost as a journalist, and he impressively fulfilled T.S. Eliot's definition of the journalist, which is that he could always find the topical excuse for writing about the permanent. It's very good, by the way, to have two distinguished journalists with us today, Greg Sheridan and Michael Cook, who will be speaking after I speak. And I think they'll be showing in their respective presentations the kind of qualities I'm trying to highlight here in Chesterton. I mentioned the handout on William Cobbett, and on the other side of the page is a short biography of Cecil Chesterton, Gilbert's brother, that I thought might be helpful for you to be able to take away. Well, let me just highlight a number of things from that handout. The first is Cobbett's championing of the rural poor. Cobbett himself came from a farming background, and while he moved to London at the age of 19, he always identified with rural life and the plight of people on the land, as their lives were disrupted in the early 19th century, especially by the Industrial Revolution. Yet Chesterton emphasises Cobbett was a realist. He loved rural England because he saw it as the basis of a free society that favoured smallness and self-sufficiency. But he was not a rural idealist or a romantic. He knew the practical realities of rural life, but he thought the freedom that it offered compensated for the sacrifices it involved. Cobbett went beyond compassion for the poor. He looked deeply into the roots of their suffering. His best-known book is called Rural Rides, based on a series of journeys around many of the most picturesque parts of the English countryside. He realised that he was touring a land now rapidly disappearing, as individual craftsmanship and cottage farming, small self-sufficient farms cultivating their own produce, were being replaced by mass production. In a piece of impassioned prose, Chesterton offered this description, which I've edited somewhat because of its length. This is what Chesterton said. What Cobbett saw was the perishing of the whole English power of self-support, the growth of cities that drain and dry up the countryside, the growth of dense, independent populations, incapable of finding their own food, the herding of humanity in nomadic masses whose very homes are homeless. In a word, Chesterton said, Cobbett saw what we see, but he saw it when it was not there. So Chesterton captured, I think, the significance of Cobbett's prophetic vision, that he could see at such an early stage of industrialisation what was happening to his country. As Dale Orquist has commented, while the Industrial Revolution produced great wealth, it also produced great poverty and great debt. What it created, in Dale's words, was, quote, a permanent underclass of wage slaves who could never save enough out of common wages to buy a farm, still less a shop in the town. And I suppose these days in Australia we might add still less a house and a home. A particularly perverse outcome, as Chesterton argued, was that modern commercialism, Chesterton said, I quote, does not punish the vices of the poor, but rather the virtues of the poor. It hampers the human character at its best and not merely at its worst. And it makes impossible even the merits that it vainly recommends. Capitalism, he said, has prevented the poor man from saving more than it has prevented him from spending. The poor were urged to be thrifty, but Chesterton thought they were not allowed to thrive, on which he thought thrift depends. We need to have done well enough to have saved so that we can be thrifty and to avoid being wasteful. Well, to move to a second point in the handout there, and that is Cobbett's sense of history. His qualities as a prophet who was able to discern at an early stage the likely course of economic and social development also enlivened him, I think, to the value of history. Studying history enables us to understand human beings more deeply and the nature of human societies. It's a major benefit of studying history, I think, that we not only learn about the past, but very often gain insights into the future, not because of any magical powers of prophecy, but because history alerts us to what is important in human life, what is deep and lasting, and what is temporary and merely fashionable. For this reason, it can help to immunise us against the extremes and the idiocies of the own age, whatever age it might be, in which we happen to be living. Cobbett demonstrated this benefit in his best-selling history of the 16th century Reformation, entitled A History of the Protestant Reformation in England and Ireland. Now, Cobbett himself was not a Catholic, but he shared the Catholic view of the great religious rupture of the 16th century, in that he believed King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries had had a devastating economic as well as religious impact. It made the plight of the English poor worse, Cobbett thought, for it had strengthened the power of the monarchy and the aristocracy by concentrating wealth even more fully in the hands of the few. It was almost a form of socialism before the word was invented. Cobbett resented this misappropriation passionately. All the more then did he oppose the distorted interpretation of the English past that prevailed in his time in English culture and that persisted well into Chesterton's 20th century. And that is the so-called Whig view of history, which saw the Protestant revolt as sweeping away the dark superstitions of the Catholic past and ushering in a new age of enlightenment after the medieval centuries, which freed Western culture from what Voltaire called the assumed superiority of the 18th century Enlightenment. Voltaire called 1,000 years of stupidity and barbarism. What Cobbett saw when he studied the English past was a sharp contradiction of this view. As he travelled on horseback around the English countryside, he saw what was in front of him, and it didn't match the version of history that he had received. Chesterton says rather whimsically that Cobbett, quote, had this strange power of faith. He could believe his eyes. How much more common, Chesterton noted, that people are encouraged to believe in what he called, quote, the wildest creeds and the crudest philosophies. By contrast, Cobbett saw things rather than accept theories. He did not believe what he had been told. He believed, rather, what he saw. Interestingly, I think, Chesterton compared Cobbett in this respect with Jane Austen. He thought that they were, I quote, the four sharpest eyes that God had given to the England of that time. Excuse me. But Jane Austen, whom Chesterton admired greatly as a novelist for showing, as he put it, so piercing a penetration of the shams of her own age, had received, he said, too much genteel education to penetrate the shams of history. Her education had been mainly an engagement with books, and her two eyes, Chesterton wrote, were turned inward into the home, whereas Cobbett's, he said, were looking out the window. Being self-educated, he read, as Chesterton put it, what was written in buildings and big monuments, in large letters of stone and clay across the land, in a giant alphabet of arch and column and flying buttress. These were things that stood out in the English landscape, such as an ancient parish church, an aristocratic mansion of a later date, and a similar palace built from the ruins of a church or at least another religious building. And these underpinned what was then the essential narrative of English history. They told the story Chesterton called of a larger religious life, which was also a popular life. That is, a culture permeated by religious values and customs that characterised and sustained popular belief and practice. Well, so far we've just focused briefly on Chesterton's main convictions about economics and history, and these had a special appeal for Chesterton since Hobbit was really spelling out in the first half of the 19th century what Chesterton was arguing in the first half of the 20th century in these two areas of economics and its effect on society, and of history, which had prepared the ground for today's society. In both these areas, Chesterton noted something that we've become used to experiencing in our own time, what Chesterton called the illiberalities of the liberal. The ready tendency for the liberal mind to cease being liberal when it ran up against an attitude it found it couldn't be liberal about. In the famous words of Ronald Reagan, the modern liberal will defend to the death your right to agree with him. Now, what Cobbett saw about the economics of England was that the 18th century Industrial Revolution was undermining the self-sufficiency of the poor and forcing them to become wage slaves. When he examined the history of England, he found that the 16th century Reformation, far from being a popular revolt, had dispossessed the poor by concentrating even more wealth and power in the hands of the rich. And these insights of Cobbett's were deeply shared by Chesterton and the distributist movement that he and Hilaire Belloc popularised a century later. As Dale Ahlquist has also pointed out, Cobbett was a distributist before there was distributism. That is, before it was developed into a social and economic philosophy of ownership and property control, that should be as widely distributed as possible. Distributism was opposed to the prevailing systems of capitalism and socialism. In the case of, and this is because they involve the concentration of power and wealth. In the case of capitalism, in the hands of a few magnates, as Chesterton once remarked, the problem with capitalism is that there are too few capitalists, not too many. And in the case of socialism, power and wealth being concentrated in the hands of governments and bureaucracies. This philosophy of distributed power was unfolded in the Catholic Church's social encyclicals, first by Pope Leo XIII, of course, in Rerum Novarum in 1891, and subsequently by later pontiffs. And it was then disseminated in the popular media, especially by Chesterton and Belloc, as well as by Chesterton's younger brother, Cecil. Now, Cecil, like Cobbett, I think, is a rather forgotten figure. He was also a journalist and of a quite different temperament from Gilbert, more fiercely combative and polemical. In fact, he was once compared to William Cobbett. Desmond McCarthy, who was a noted literary critic and journalist at the time, described Cecil, quote, as the best pugnacious journalist since Cobbett. Described Cecil as the best pugnacious journalist since Cobbett. I think we can reasonably surmise that a compelling reason for G.K. Chesterton's admiration of William Cobbett, given the huge differences between Chesterton and Cobbett in rhetorical style and public activism, was that Cobbett reminded Chesterton of Cecil. Gilbert loved and revered his younger brother, who died prematurely in his late 30s, nearly 20 years before his older brother. This was at the end of World War I. And Gilbert finished with this tribute to his younger brother. He said, "A portrait is impossible. As a friend, he is too near me, and as a hero, too far away." Now, Gilbert and Cecil shared many things, including the Catholic faith, Cecil becoming a Catholic in 1912, some years before Gilbert. And yet Cecil was so different to G.K., who was all playful and kindly, even when fervently serious. Cecil actually resembled Cobbett in his hard-hitting and combative journalism. What Gilbert says about Cobbett, that he was a man of combative passions, as Chesterton describes Cobbett, could well have applied to his younger brother. He recalled that as brothers growing up, he and Cecil perpetually argued, but they never quarrelled. A nice distinction to highlight, I think, in our own pretty polarised age, where it's becoming hard to make an argument without its causing a quarrel. An English journalist, Samuel Radcliffe, wrote of Cecil that he pounded hard and everlastingly in the same place. That is the place that Cecil criticised incessantly, the amount of political collusion he found and corruption in public life. At the time, which he greatly regretted because of its devastating effect on the poor. Week by week, Radcliffe said, Cecil Chesterton, quote, gave himself and his invective no rest. In a similar way, William Cobbett could be powerfully and unforgivingly provocative. There was another way in which Cecil Chesterton resembled Cobbett, and that is that each started a weekly radical newspaper. In Cobbett's case, two such newspapers, one in America and one in England. The one in America in the late 18th century was called Peter's Porcupine, which was Cobbett's pen name in America, Peter Porcupine. And the second weekly newspaper, the Political Register, which he edited in London for over 30 years until Cobbett's death in 1835. In Cecil's case, the newspaper was called The New Witness, which he edited for 4 years before he went to join the British Army in World War I, later dying in France of trench fever near the end of the war. Well, this is a suitable entry point for discussing the third and final quality of William Cobbett's that I'd like to highlight today, and that is his courage as a controversialist. He led a turbulent life. He joined the British Army as a young man, and during his years of service, he taught himself English grammar, which prepared him for his later career as a journalist. But he found the corruption at that time intolerable, and he brought charges against former officers. And this led to his fleeing from England, at first to France, which was just in the middle of the French Revolution, and then to the United States for some years, settling with his family in Philadelphia. America had a significant impact on him. In Chesterton's colourful words, the furious tenderness of exile, the furious tenderness of exile gave Cobbett inspiration. If I may add my own experience briefly to Chesterton's comments, I too found the United States had the same inspirational impact on myself from my first visit in the 1970s when I was a university librarian, and followed by numerous visits subsequently. America, I must say, gave me a great sense of possibilities, and its blend of similarities and differences with my own culture enabled me to understand Australia a lot better. In particular, its liberal arts colleges, of course, were an educational model that greatly inspired me during the long planning years of Campion College. Well, returning to William Cobbett, again, this time in America, his ferocious journalism got him into trouble yet again. He had to pay a heavy fine in a libel judgment against him. He returned to England, actually spending a couple of years in jail and paying a large fine for condemning the whipping of militiamen, that is, citizen soldiers, who had complained about unfair deductions from their pay. Later, Cobbett fled again to America to avoid arrest. The British government at that time seeing every protest or proposal for change as a form of sedition. And Cobbett and his family settled in Long Island in New York State. By this time, as Chesterton points out, Cobbett was becoming a sceptic. Not about crowns and creeds, said Chesterton, but about things that the world round him reverenced far more than any creed or crown. And by this, Chesterton meant Cobbett was doubting more and more the pieties of capitalist success, and what Chesterton called the abstract and invisible, we might say the transcendental part of modern capitalism, the national debts and the international loans. And Chesterton only wrote that 100 years ago. What Cobbett showed through all of this is what we used to call the courage of his convictions. He was not a fence sitter, nor in a journalistic sense a space filler, putting words into empty newspaper columns. His long editorship of the Political Register, in particular, enabled him, as Chesterton noted, to keep his intellectual independence, which he prized so deeply. He was a natural controversialist, always direct and hard-hitting. And these days we might jump on words like divisive to describe how he presented his views. Chesterton, I think, captures this rather more subtly and accurately when he says of Cobbett that some people, quote, could not hear him because he talked so loud, and that his message was too loud to be clear. It turned out he was not obscure or evasive enough. Chesterton says that Cobbett, quote, did not soothe those in the political and literary world with those formless but familiar obscurities which they expected as the proper prelude to any political suggestion. He came to the point, Chesterton said, too quickly. Chesterton has some fun highlighting the tendency, even then, for our culture to resort to long words and complicated phrases to obscure rather than reveal the truth. For example, Cobbett would have said, writes Chesterton, that when a man told lies, he called him a liar, and not a person insensible to the value of objective reality. Malcolm Muggeridge, the late British journalist, used to lament how often, when he was an editorial writer for what was then the Manchester Guardian, now the Guardian, he would resort to what he called non-language as a form of obliteration to ensure that he didn't say anything too controversial or provocative. Muggeridge recalled using, and I quote, drooling non-sentences, conveying non-thoughts, propounding non-fears, and offering non-hopes. Words are as beautiful as love, Muggeridge said, and as easily betrayed. And he gives examples of such betrayals of language that we can readily enough recognise as fatuous, such as, there are solid grounds for hoping. No thinking man will underestimate the... Such is a choice that at present confronts, etc., etc. It wasn't hard for Muggeridge to think of examples, and it wouldn't be hard for us to either. Well, just to conclude, Chesterton himself concluded his biography of Cobbett on what seems a sombre note. He, as Cobbett lay dying in his farmhouse in Surrey, in the English county where he was born, he could well have felt a lonely failure. And yet his apparent defeat did turn into victory, at least of a certain kind. His radically different view of the effects of the 16th century Reformation, that the rich were hugely advantaged in relation to the poor, had an impact, as Joseph Pearce has pointed out, on the movement that led to the Catholic emancipation in England, which occurred in 1829, which gave political freedom to Catholics after centuries of discrimination. And Cobbett also influenced, Joseph said, certain neo-medievalist movements in the 19th century, such as the Gothic revival, an architectural style that was influential even in Australia, in our cathedrals, for example, in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. And of course, into the 20th centuries, the distributist movement led by Belloc and Chesterton. So while Chesterton is melancholy about Cobbett's immediate impact, he ends on a hopeful note about Cobbett's long-term influence. In the 19th century, Chesterton argues, the world believed that it was becoming, quote, modern and many-sided, whereas Cobbett alone thought it was growing narrow and mean, enraptured by the traps as well as the opportunities of mechanical progress. That larger vision of Cobbett's, laments Chesterton, died with him and vanished for 100 years. Well, we might nourish the hope that this vision is no longer dead, and that in our socially and environmentally sensitive age, we will strengthen our love of the poor, perhaps especially the rural poor, and value their being free and independent, and that this vision can find a more substantial presence in our culture in the 21st century. Thank you very much. Well, I've I've left some time for questions. Michael's paper will start at 10 o'clock, but please ask questions or comments. Stephen?
Cobbett also had an influence on the English Chartist movement. One of whose members was Henry Parkes, who had a big influence on Australia's political development. Now, he also had influence in other areas. His religious influence wasn't very good for Catholics, but politically, it meant that we did not have W.C. Wentworth's ideas of having a titled aristocracy, and we were based on free franchise. In a sense, we, I suppose, beneficiaries as Australians of Cobbett's thoughts and his influence on Chartism.
Yes, that's very, very interesting to hear. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you. Yes, Frank. Yeah. Oh, Paddy, sorry. Yeah.
Karl, what shocked me when I read one book by William Cobbett, besides its clunky language, was the fact that the poor were so devastated by the Reformation. And my home, because I have done a history degree and everything, and I was completely unaware of the social impact of the English Reformation on its own people. How is it that we have buried that knowledge, and it's only really sort of coming to only in very short circles? I mean, many people in our society today don't even know about the English Reformation, let alone the horrible impact it had on the English society. How was it buried? I don't know.
No, well, you assume in particular, and I suppose there's certainly evidence that the same kind of thing is occurring today, and that is once a particular view identified with those who are the rulers, those in power, who have the power and wealth, not only, as it were, gets embedded and enunciated at that level, but that it then flows down to universities, schools, and of course is passed from generation to generation. So I think that sort of ensures that it's any alternative view is buried. It's not acceptable, and this is a fairly familiar pattern, I think. So it took not quite the collapse, but the great decline of that view, faced with the realities of what was happening to the poor, what was happening to the economy, to start looking again at the history of their own culture and revising it. So all sorts of books that I can think of, for example, looking at the strength of popular Catholic life in England prior to the Reformation, in Eamon Duffy's book, The Stripping of the Altars, which makes very clear that this was not a religion that had petered out and the dissolution of monasteries was doing a favour. Rather the opposite, that there was underneath the surface a very strong popular religious tradition that was basically just gradually eliminated. Yes, Gary?
Did you have a smile on your face, Karl, when you were reading Chesterton criticising another writer about his use of language?
Yes, well, it's something probably journalists, and he was so much quintessentially that, shouldn't do really. Only say nice things about fellow writers. You never know when it's going to come back to bite you. Yes.
Karl, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what was the contrast between what William Cobbett saw when he was travelling around England and what he'd been told. Could you go into a bit more detail about what was he told to expect, and what did he actually see, and how were they different?
Yes, well, yeah, I tried to sort of hit at that, John, in what he saw, where I suppose where he saw various ruins, including economically, where the poor were really in a dispossessed state and weren't able to look after themselves, weren't able to produce their own food and so on. And then the ruins that were there, the religious ruins, which in one sense you'd say, oh well, you know, the religion had run out of puff and that's why they're all in ruins. But then he saw, as I think I mentioned in one description, how these have been reused by those, the new rulers of the economy and the society. And then bubbling underneath, as mentioned, people like Eamon Duffy revealed was, you know, a great deal more energy and vitality and faithfulness than was acknowledged. And again, I think, you know, we can think of other historical situations where this is the case. I think, for example, the French Revolution over the years has been mentioned, where the old order had apparently been overturned, and that included the religious order with great number of executions of religious priests and religious brothers and sisters. And you'd think, well, it's all over, isn't it? And then you look at the 19th century after the Revolution, and the extraordinary new energy that was apparent in new religious orders. In other words, the vitality of that popular religious tradition remained remarkably strong. And I mean, we have it here at Campion, this very campus, the main building over there was constructed in the late 1930s by the Maris fathers. Well, Maris fathers were a French religious order, apart from the Maris brothers who started schools. So you can see again and again where did that vitality come from? It's not explicable in terms that have been set down for us as the framework of understanding. There's a lot more to it, and Cobbett, I mean, I think he, particularly because he felt so passionately about the plight of the poor, and he knew what it was like. He lived a fairly tough life. It wasn't sort of writing from the cloisters or from up in the tower. He was down there living for people. He'd been a farmer. He knew what it was like. He knew what it was like to get into trouble, which he did. But I think again, as he moved around, and the book Rural Rides is probably the book that I mentioned in the handout and touched on here. Is probably the main one where he described what he saw. So I haven't looked, but that may well be available on Kindle, or apart from probably in reprints these days. But he just basically said, well, the two don't gel. What I've received as the interpretation doesn't match what I'm seeing. Yes, David.
Karl, I think the video will show that at one point you referred to him as Hobbit.
Yes.
Obviously with his love of the English village life, but he also has the dwarvish combativeness, doesn't he? And he has the elvish appreciation of culture, and he even has a bit of the Boromir impatience. And with all these qualities, my question is, why, when he gets to Parliament at the end of his life, did he not feel that this was the fulfilment of all that he cared and loved and fought for? And why did he kill him?
Yes, well, very good questions, David. Yes, that was how many times Michael will reveal this and say, well, you mentioned Cobbett, 421 times, and you mentioned Hobbit twice, I think he didn't well, he reminds me a little bit of Hilaire Belloc, who had a similar, rather combative temperament. And Belloc went into Parliament, and when he served his 3 years as a member of Parliament, the British Parliament, he left. He didn't go for re-election, and he said that he was glad to be rid of the dirtiest company of men which he had found himself. So, you know, yeah, but Hilaire was always very mild in his language. He would have appreciated Cobbett. But I think and again, I suppose with the way the media worked in particular, there wasn't the instantaneous depiction of what people were saying and what they said in print, and there was a massive amount, of course, an explosion of print. It was so easy to start journals, for example, in those days, as I mentioned, with both Cobbett and Cecil Chesterton, that you know, they were more inclined to speak their mind, and then no doubt still had some residual faith in where the decisions were made, until they actually got there and found that it was a bit more doubtful as to whether the decisions were being made, and that Parliament, you know, was more of a facade and a masquerade than a centre of reality. Simeon.
Thanks, Carl. I've got a follow-up from David. So how did Cobbett seek to go about doing something, actually accomplishing the changes, the developments through parliamentary processes, popular action, and are there any lessons there for the current generation?
Yes, well, he didn't, as it were, you know, go back greatly into the farming world. I mean, he looked after his family when he lived in America the 2 times, and in England. But I think he felt he had a gift for popularising certain views that were unpopular, and that was his vocation to do that. That's the greatest good he could do, is convince people, particularly those in some positions of influence, how they could change the prevailing system and produce something better. So, in terms of advantages or lessons, you might say, for our time, that is, I think, not immediately obvious in the sense, as I was just touching on there in response to David, and that is that the hypersensitivity of our age, heightened greatly by the way modern media works and is recorded, so these things can be played and replayed many years later, which is not the same as being quoted by something that you said 20 years before in print, in a print journal. I remember a Jesuit priest friend of mine, Father James Shaw in America, died several years ago, and I was asking him one time about Professor James Hitchcock in St. Louis, who was writing a lot about the current state of the church. And Jim Shaw had become, he's always an Orthodox Catholic, but I think he'd become more strongly and vocally that. And Jim Hitchcock had been more of a liberal who decided that this was a disastrous course for the church to take from the 1960s onwards. I said, so how have you found his writings, Jim? Talking to Jim Shaw, and he said, Karl, he's a dangerous man. He remembers what I wrote in the 1960s. Well, as Woody Allen said, I think, if you can remember what I said in the 1960s, you weren't there. At any rate, I think by looking at people like this who are fearless and also very articulate and have a vision, I think, well, the spirit I think you can pick up, and in certain ways, you know, there'd be other lessons as well, I'm sure. Well, I should just draw this to a close now, ladies and gentlemen, so that I don't infringe on Michael Cook's time. But if we can just have a changeover at this point, and I'll invite Michael to come forward, and I'll, because of David Daintrey's absence, David was going to introduce Michael, but I'll briefly do so when Michael comes. So thank you very much.